So, Kelsey, you want to do a little intro and then we'll dive on in?
All right, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for Museum Workers Advocacy Day. I'm so happy that this is a recurring project and that so many people are interested in it. And I'm grateful to be here with Michelle today to talk about salary and other negotiations. So I'm Kelsey Bro. I'm the co-president of NEMPN. I'm based in New York City, and I'm the executive director of King Manor Museum, a small historic house near JFK Airport. Michelle.
My name is Michelle Ending. I'm currently a strategy manager at Xero, which is a boutique consulting firm. I function as the NEMPN treasurer. I'm currently based in the Detroit metro area. So if you're ever up here, come say hi.
All right, and here's our agenda for the day. So we'll talk about where salary fits into the job offer, how to negotiate that, where to look at salary information while you're deciding if you want this job or if you even want to apply for it, other things you might be able to negotiate, benefits, PTO, things like that, and a discussion. And we'll be asking
Am I the only one who's got Kelsey frozen?
We lost Kelsey.
Okay. Um, Perfect. Then I'm happy to jump on in. So we'll kind of walk through each of these. Again, feel free to stop us if you've got questions. We'll start with a little bit of like where there's a lot more to your job offer than just the salary. I know sometimes it feels like the salary is the only thing there, but there's a little bit more. So we'll start with that. We'll then talk about negotiating. What is the right tactic for negotiation? We have some scripts that we can provide if you haven't done salary negotiation before or you're unsure how to approach that. We'll then talk a little bit about information finding. So how do you find the right content to back up your negotiation discussion? And then what else can you negotiate around that's not necessarily your salary? And we'll kind of open the field at the end for final conversation. So with that, let me kick off with talking a little bit about where does your salary fit into your job offer? Again, we recognize that your salary is really critical, right? I recognize that that is typically what is allowing you to do things like pay for rent and buy groceries, get transportation, pay for healthcare if your company doesn't provide that, etc. So it's a very critical component of your offer. However, it is not the only piece. It is not the only piece that you can negotiate on typically. So just kind of ranked from high to low here. We'll focus on the salary today. I think that's the one that most folks are very comfortable with and understand that there's some negotiation around. And there's a lot of resources available to help bolster that discussion. But there's a couple of other things in here that we'll talk about later today in that medium category, things like if your organization offers things like bonuses, adjustments to start dates, things around flexibility for things like work location or PTO, if they have any incentives that you can have discourse around. Typically, the things that we find are not very open to negotiation are things like your job title, things like your responsibilities, who your boss is on a day-to-day basis, and your benefits in particular can be a little bit of a challenge around negotiations, typically because they're organized organization-wide. So just things to keep in mind. If you're applying to a role or if you're in the middle of interviewing for a role and the title or responsibilities don't feel like a fit, or if you've had interviews with your upcoming manager or folks in your reporting structure or stack and they don't feel like a great fit, it may not be worth it to continue in that conversation or job application interview because those are likely not going to change unless they have another role that suddenly opens and you say, hey, I'm actually interested in this other role. If there's a different reporting structure, et cetera, that better fits my interests for responsibilities. But if the responsibilities aren't a good fit, probably not a good fit generally, because you're not going to have a lot of leverage to adjust those once you've joined. They're normally looking for someone to fill a particular hole. With that, let me pause. Anyone have anything else that you have negotiated on before that is not on this list? Drop that in the chat if yes. And anyone who's got something on this list that you've successfully negotiated, please drop that in the chat as well. We may talk about that at the end in our open discussion. All right, then with that, let's talk a little bit about how we kind of understand, hey, salary is the biggest thing to negotiate on, so that's why we're focusing on that today. But how do you do that?
I don't know where I left off when my cat unplugged my Wi-Fi, but just to echo what Michelle said, please put any examples that you have of good salary negotiation in the chat. Maybe we can all learn from them and read from them later. Remember, when you're negotiating the salary, they expect you to negotiate, but they also don't, right? Especially the museum field, very women dominated. And there's a lot of studies out there that show women do not advocate for themselves salary wise. So do negotiate your salary. It is nothing personal. It is a job. They're not going to be offended by that. And we'll show with some data in the next slide, but talk about what you are offering them and what you need back. Remember, a job is a mutual relationship, especially when you're job hunting in a difficult field like ours. It can really seem like you as the applicant are at the losing end of the stick, but they need you to fulfill a role, and that role is crucial for their institution. And how can you put yourself in a position where you can make a long-term impact using kind of language like that that shows the benefit of giving you a better benefits, better salary, better whatever it is to the museum is going to put you in a really strong position. And then Michelle, do you want to talk about bullet point 3? I feel like I've heard a lot of mixed things about that.
Yeah, let's talk about numbers. Should you give a number? When do you give a number? Are there ranges that are acceptable? The typical best practice for this is if you're asked point blank what's the number, right? Or do you have a range that you're considering, etc. We'd always recommend a range. Always come in with a range instead of a hard number. That indicates two things. One, that you understand that, hey, there may be a top or bottom end I'm willing to take. And if you hit closer to my top end of the number, I'm going to be more incented to accept the position. The other piece here is that a range indicates that you've likely done some research. Again, we'll talk about that later today, but where do you do your research? How do you play your numbers? But that range indicates that you've also done research and probably know what is a reasonable number to be paid, both maybe in your city, in your area, but also based on other information available about that specific organization. So feel free to give a range. When we say give a range, give a reasonable range. It is not productive or helpful to give them a range that is $50,000 worth of range, right? That doesn't help a recruiter on the other end of the table or someone in HR decide where in the range you should sit. I typically don't recommend giving a range that's more than $20,000 between the top and bottom end, because at least that way they know, hey, she's either way over our range, way under our range. We're kind of somewhere in that middle ground. And that can also help foster the discussion. So feel free to provide those. When it says you should never give a number, we don't want you to start a discourse with a hard number in mind and have them say, ooh, perfect. That's less than we were planning to pay them. That's less than we budgeted for the role. Which is why if you come in with a range, you've given yourself a little bit of protection on that, to know that, hey, there's a band that I'm willing to have a conversation in. It also, that range gives you an opportunity to talk to them about some of the other things that we can negotiate around. So if they can't hit the bottom number in your range, or the bottom number in your range is the very high end of theirs, they recognize that there's going to be some discussion about things that are not salary for them to maybe budge on to get you to where you want to be. I know that some folks may be like, well, I don't want to give a number at all. Same. I've been through a lot of interviews where I'd love to not provide a number and have them give me a number instead. And feel free to offer and nudge them in that direction. If they ask you for a number, it's completely acceptable. This is a two-way dialogue as part of interviews. Feel free to say, does your organization have a range in mind for this role? I know we've got a lot of change in the museum field. Not every role posts a range, which is unfortunate. But if you haven't seen a range already, ask if they have a range in mind. And then you can tell them, hey, like I'm willing to have a discussion about it, but I want to kind of understand where you guys are coming from for initial thoughts on range for the role and the responsibilities that I saw online. and then provide your own information range. Very rarely anymore are you going to get away with not providing a number at all. So just keep that in mind. I know it'd be great to never have to provide a number and have them simply send you a number, but very, very rarely does that ever occur. Also be mindful with your organization. If you're going to provide a number or a range, they may want it as annual salary, and they may also want it as hourly rate, depending on what the posting requires. So if you're in a part-time posting, they're likely looking at your hourly rate instead of your overall annual salary number. So prepare that appropriately when you provide it. So you may do the math and say, hey, I want X numbers per year, and this is the whole number I want. That's fine. Divide that out. You can do some calculations online. There's plenty of good resources for that, to divide that to get your hourly rate, to then provide that to somebody else. The last thing I'll note here, and we'll talk about that in depth in a minute as well, is also being mindful of local requirements for bare minimum salaries in your area. That may sound really dumb to say out loud, but I want it said that especially when you may be looking at relocating for a museum job, you may not know what the minimum salary is for hourly workers in the location you're moving to. Many large metropolitan areas and districts have legislated higher minimum wages than the state or than the nation that you may be looking to work in. So keep that in mind, especially when you're moving to large, high density populated areas, that their minimum hourly wage may be higher than what you're already making, or than an expectation, because of the legislation applied locally. Let me pause. Questions on any of this before we jump into maybe some sample scripts for where you're like, okay, it's fine to negotiate. Let's talk about how you actually do that.
One quick point I also wanted to make out is some jobs will ask you about your previous salary, and you don't have to disclose that. Especially like Michelle just said, if you're moving from a cost of living area that's a bit more modest to a much higher cost of living, like a dense urban city, that's not going to be commensurate at all. Or if you had a part-time role and are looking at a salaried interview, so you can, instead of mentioning your previous salary, go ahead and mention a range, even if they don't ask you for it.
All right, great. So let's then talk about how you actually do the negotiation. So when we jump into negotiating for your actual salary, one, we want to do a couple of things. One, thank you, right? We recognize that we're to the point where someone has extended an offer to you. So that's very exciting. We want to thank them for that, regardless of whether or not we have an intention to take the offer, regardless of what the number came in at, right? If you're going back to negotiate, the number was clearly less than you would have liked. So let's just remember that everyone spent time, money, and effort doing the interview process. So a thank you is always applicable in this case. And feel free to add as much or as little on that front end of like, thank you, I'm excited to join the team, etc. We're then going to insert the however, right? Or the but. We want to have a discussion around compensation. And the reason we use the language compensation here instead of salary is to open the window and doors, all available exits, right, to them adjusting anything in your total compensation package. Sometimes that is salary, and that's where we like to start, because that's the easiest thing typically for an institution to adjust, is that salary number. But if you mention compensation as a whole, they recognize that there are other strings and levers they may be able to pull internally that contribute to that compensation package. So we want to use that language around compensation really, really specifically. No, it gives an HR person and whoever does that internally in finance an indicator that like, aha, this is not only about the money, it's about this whole package. We then provide notes that, hey, I have done my research, right? Like, I'm not just asking that I want this pie in the sky number. Everyone would love to maybe be a millionaire or billionaire. They're not going to pay us like that. So you've done research, so you have some kind of grounding in reality about current market value for this role, what you expect to be paid. And you can provide that and say, hey, I'm looking for a salary of X or this range for the role. looking at reality, frankly, based on negotiations that I've ever had for roles, I would say expect them to be flexible up to 10 to 15% of the total salary that they initially offer you. So if you come in and let's say they've offered you $75,000, I have never heard of a case in which they are going to bring that up to six figures at $100,000, period, right? Think about the math on that. That's a 33% increase on what their base number was for you. It's not going to happen. Up to a 15% number is high, but is reasonable if you have appropriate data in terms of flex for organizations to try to keep you, to try to contain and have you sign contract to be part of their staff, especially if you feel like a really good fit or you have a really good skills alignment. So just keep that in mind as you're going back and forth with them. We're also able to adjust some of the language here in the second half, right? It may be, hey, you know, you did everyone's done some research. We're going to show you how to do that research next, but you've done this research. This is my value, or I'm really excited about something on your team or what your organization is working on or part of the role that I'm going to get to complete. So for me to be able to commit to that, this is the number that I need, right? So lean in where you felt like you have the most connection with the organization, and feel free to this is again a two-way negotiation. Feel free to pull a little bit of the emotional heartstrings for whoever's on the side from HR. They've offered you a role. That means that they like you, they feel like you're a good fit. So feel free to lean on that when you're negotiating, right? Put yourself in a good negotiating position. The other thing I will mention, and I know I've gotten this question a lot when I've worked with folks, is on negotiations and salary management, is are they going to rescind my offer if I negotiate? They shouldn't. I've never heard of a case where someone went back to negotiate and they rescinded an offer. I've heard cases where they could not find a middle ground, so you had to decline an offer. That's completely reasonable. But frankly, I recognize this space can be quite hard to get into or to move around in museums. So it may be really challenging to say, hey, you know, I need this role. I'm really concerned that they're going to rescind the offer if I go back and negotiate. They won't, and to me, that's a massive red flag organizationally if they're not willing to negotiate with you, because it means they're going to continue to try to take advantage of you when you start working there. So just things to keep in mind, right? The same way that you may see red flags as you start to enter friendships or relationships, etc. Employers have lots of red flags too, and that is one of them. If you, maybe the last thing I'll note here, and I see a couple questions in chat, and then we'll possibly answer those. If they come back to you with an offer, or if they fail to come back with you for an offer, ask for review time. Make sure that when you're sending back the offer or the negotiation, if you do the back and forth, they say, okay, we're willing to come up to this number. They may give you, you know, in that email, or someone may call you. A lot of times they'll call you and say, hey, you know, we saw your email. We'd love to talk. Like, we think we can come up to this. Make sure you get it in writing. Please make sure you get it in writing in your offer letter, updated via email or however they're sending it to you. Owl Post, whatever they're using, that you have the new numbers or whatever they're adjusting to in writing before you agree to anything. So even if they call you, I've had cases like this. I have someone call, hey, we saw your negotiation. We'd love to, you know, meet you at the number you wanted. We're willing to meet you at the number. That's great. Be excited about hearing that over the phone if they called you for that. But tell them, I'm going to need 24 hours, a couple of days, etc., to digest that, to review that, to really understand that. Would you mind sending that over in writing? And then I can send you back a response. Because they know that the likely answer is yes, but neither you nor they are legally compliant for something that you've agreed to over the phone until you have it on a sheet of paper. So that's our sidebar for negotiating is, should your negotiation be successful, make sure you get that in writing. And even if it's not, get that in writing so that you have future offer letters for comparison when you go and search for other work. With that, I see a couple of things in the chat. I see a question, can you negotiate a salary if a number is given in the job posting, or does applying imply that you're comfortable with that amount? Great question. You can always negotiate, or you can ask to negotiate even if they had a number in the posting. Recognize that the number in the posting is likely where they're benchmarking as the minimum number for that offer. And if they had a range, that probably is the hard range. So if they gave you an offer that was at the bottom of that range, it's completely reasonable to come back and say, hey, I saw when the posting was up that the range was from, 65 to 75. You came back at 65 or 63. I'd love if we could get it to 70. Can we talk about, why you don't think I have a skills match? Because these are the things that I think are reasonable examples of why I would deserve that middle number range. Totally willing to negotiate there. Just recognize they may be more sticklers about the numbers if they posted numbers. And they're very likely not going to come high outside of that range. So if they posted a range that was 65 to 70 and you're looking for 90, I would probably recommend not applying because they're likely not going to come up to 90 on that. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to post a follow-up in the chat. Any other questions on this, on ways to word that negotiation, on cases where you've tried to negotiate and been shut down or been successful that anyone wants to share or talk about?
Well, we let folks in the audience think about anything they'd like to share. I want to share something from my experience very early on in my career. And I was thinking about this with the previous presentation as well for museums moving forward about how entry-level jobs often have a higher job satisfaction rate. Well, that's because you don't know, you're not as embedded in the office politics, for one. And something that happened to me, and I think is pretty common in the early stages of your museum career, is that you might work someplace as a per diem, and then there is a full-time position that opens up that you apply for. And if you are very inexperienced like I was, you will not ask the salary because you will think that your per diem rate was fair, and that of course you're going to get a fair rate when you're offered a salaried position. Joke's on me, the salary was 4 days a week at $18K for a bilingual master's required job in Manhattan. But I didn't feel like I was in a position for personal reasons to turn down that job at the beginning of my career. So make sure that you don't do what I did and do your due diligence. And we'll talk a lot about how to do that in the next part of the slide. But when Michelle mentioned getting that offer in writing, make sure you do that. And it's not only so they can't say, what, we never talked about that. It's also for you so that you can have some time to make sure that this really is going to work for your personal needs.
It's a really good call out, Kelsey. I see a couple of comments in the chat. I'm going to voice these over just especially for the recording for folks who don't have access to the chat after this. We've got a good comment that someone's noticed the job announcements for the University of California system now include the salary range for the position as well as the expected step in ranges, which is awesome. I know there's a lot of groups that are moving to that where they're like, hey, this is the range, and then here also the expected adjustments in range later. Frankly, I know like the US government is really good at that because they are required to by law to post those ranges. So that's fabulous. Let's see, we've got another question in here. Can you talk about salary transparency in relation to negotiation, like learning a coworker makes more, but you have the same position and gender factors there? Oh, yes. You're going to get me on a little bit of a soapbox, so I apologize in advance. Salary transparency is not yet rampant and pervasive, both in this industry or series of industries, as well as holistically across the United States, frankly, across most of the globe yet. We are getting there, luckily. But salary transparency, so if you happen to have exposure to, hey, someone at my level or someone doing the same job is making more for XYZ, they're making more in the same location, same position, or even maybe in a different location, but similar position, similar job responsibilities. That's a great, especially because you've already been hired, right? Someone's already paying you to be there. This is a great opportunity to engage with whoever your people resource or human resources group is, that is your normal day-to-day liaison or advocate with those teams, to open a dialogue about that. One, do it in writing. Everything you do related to salary discourse and discussion, negotiation, etc., should always be documented in writing. Lovingly, this does not include Slack. This does not mean Teams. This does not mean text. This does not mean GroupMe. This means you send them an email with your questions and dialogue and justification, because all of those other methods that are not email are not official discourse with your HR person. That's the unfortunate legal truth. If someone comes in and looks for that later, your texts don't count on having HR text you back with a question answer. So if you hear that, feel free to raise that with your HR person. A good script for that may sound something like, hey, human, hey, Kelsey, I was in conversations with coworker. If you feel comfortable putting that coworker's name in, please do. But I was in conversations with a coworker who is currently filling role X in X location. Make sure you include a location if you happen to work somewhere that has multiple site locations, or maybe someone who is on like the back office side of the house instead of the front visitor facing side of the house, just so that they're aware of who that person is if they've never worked with them. They mentioned that their salary is X, while mine is Y. And I would love to have a conversation to better understand the difference in our pay gap, noting that, you know, I was under the impression, and again, feel free to adjust this based on how much information you have, but I was under the impression that we had similar roles and responsibilities, similar qualifications, and or similar background. It's important that you highlight those things because there may be cases where you may not have a really thorough understanding of your coworker's background, and surprise, they may have a couple of additional degrees, they may have more experience, there may be something else that they're bringing to the table on the back end where, you know, maybe Kelsey, I'm saying like, hey, I don't know, why is Kelsey getting paid more than me? We're doing the same job. Well, someone says, hey, you may not know this, but Kelsey's also doing all of the prep for our board planning and meetings in addition to what she does for the job that you guys hold the same title for. Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of that. My bad. There's like a justification for her having maybe something extra on top of her salary over me. But feel free to flag that with your HR team. That's a really good thing to be asking about. And I see that the second part of that was tell me about gender there. There is a tendency to underpay folks that are in minority positions, whether that is due to gender, race, language proficiencies. Any and all of those things are potential for there to be a salary difference. That's not to say that there will always be, but just be mindful that if you feel like you are in the minority of folks in your organization or against your leadership or board, that there may be discrepancy. And if you're comfortable initiating and having discussions with coworkers about what you're currently being paid, that there may be an opportunity to go and negotiate with HR about an adjustment to ensure that you're in line with your coworkers.
And that goes back to what I said at the very top, which hopefully my Wi-Fi was working at that point, that women often don't, or people in other minority positions often don't go into a role negotiating a salary. So if me, Kelsey, and my male friend Kels O joined an organization at the same time, I might be starting at 60 and he might be starting at 70 just because he negotiated and I didn't. So then of course, if we're in the same role for 4 years, our raises, especially if they're based on a percentage of our salary, are going to leave us at very different places. So it might not even necessarily be an on-purpose thing that people are doing, but just how everybody started at the beginning. So make sure to advocate for yourself at all times.
We've also got one other question in here, and Kelsey, I may hand this to you to have a conversation around, is tips for advocating for increases for your reports. So maybe it's not for you, but maybe you're managing and you have folks that you'd like to advocate for a salary increase. Kelsey, talk to me a little bit about tips for that.
Yeah, so I think this can depend slightly what your role is, right? So you have reports, who do you report to? Is it a board or is it HR? Is it another upper management person? Is it an executive director? But in general, you want to come with data, right? And we're going to talk later on about where you get some of that data. But some of my colleagues have reached out to people in similar fields. So I make my career in small museums. So people will reach out, we'll all reach out to each other and say, hey, what are you paying for this type of role? I'm looking for information to give my board so that they will understand that I need to raise pretty significantly my staff's salaries. So that's one thing to do, especially if you're an executive director or somebody reporting directly to a board. It's also my opinion that boards should not have a lot of say in the day-to-day operations of how you run your museum. So thinking about restructuring something like that, getting the board to understand really what their role is. And then if you are, say, somebody working for a large museum and you're in maybe middle management, you have some reports, it very much the same concept. Look at that data, look at other museums of your same style of museum. And if there's not really something in your area, let's say you're in a more rural area and there's not another maybe big or medium-sized museum there that has kind of the same feel and audience as other places, you can look farther away. Of course, if you're, say, in Arkansas, looking at New York City is not going to give you the best information, but you can still kind of translate that into like percentage of cost of living and do that. And I would also say definitely look at cost of living as far as data goes as well. And because when you're advocating for other folks and you're also middle management, that means you don't, sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, sometimes the squeaky wheel gets punctured, right? You want to make sure that you're protecting yourself as well. So I think coming in with as much data as possible, and then also bringing up how much value your reports bring to the institution. So you can use some internal data as well. Like let's say if they're facilitators for programs, say X amount of people come to these programs, really look at that impact. What is it that they're doing for your institution? Because unfortunately, a lot of times people in upper management are pulled in from other fields like business, and they don't really have the sense of running an institution for the passion that a lot of us do. Maybe they do, but for them, a lot of times the bottom line is dollars. And if you can show them how maybe not necessarily dollars correlate because it's a free program that these people are facilitating, but visitorship and how that you can use that to write grants or do other things that support not only the mission, but the economic stability of your institution, that's going to put you in a really powerful position to advocate for your reports. Anything you'd want to add to that, Michelle?
No, I think that's spot on. It's a combination of bring the data for your people, both internal and external. External data for that comparison on pay, for justification of why they need to be at a number, and internal data for impact that they're making or value that they're delivering, so that there's a one-to-one to say, Kelsey brings in, 20,000 visitors a year or affects that many folks as they're coming in for school programming. So it makes sense that if that's our primary driver as a KPI as the organization, then we would want to make sure that she's properly incented to stay and continue to do that work. I do see the question from Madison. We're coming to that next. So let me jump into, we've been talking a lot about bring the data, and you're like, that's great. Where do I find the data? Let's talk a little bit about where we find data. As a data geek, let's talk about all the data. There's so much data, you guys. Lots and lots of places to find data, especially and lovingly and luckily, because the places that we work are typically registered 501c3s. This may feel like a lot of times that is not in your favor, right? You may be like, yes, but Michelle, that means that they don't have a lot of money. Sometimes, but it means that they have to publicly report all of their financials. This is where it does you a service. If you do not currently have a GuideStar account, I would absolutely recommend get yourself a GuideStar account. They are free. And what it will do is allow you to go look up your organization or the organization that you're looking at, going to ask for a raise or salary at. You can put them in. This is all the registered 501c3s in the US, and it will pull up their organizational reports, any information on board, etc. So especially if that is not super visible, if you work at a smaller mid-sized museum that maybe does not maintain very good web presence, etc., that's a great starting place to look because it has to be on their paperwork. It also provides you their 990s. We're going to talk about 990s in a minute because you're probably like, if you don't do some of your organization's reporting, you may not know what a 990 is. We're going to talk about that in a sec. We'll look at them in detail. But that will provide you salary data and information for people in your organization, for the highest paid folks in your group, as well as any contracting resources that they leverage. So this is a great place to benchmark for both the organization you're talking to and similar organizations. So you may say, hey, Kelsey works at a smaller mid-sized museum in a particular zip code. I happen to have a couple of small and mid-sized museums that are in adjacent zip codes that I can also go look at the pay data for to comp for my salary adjustment or for someone else's who maybe reports to me's salary adjustments. So super duper great resource. Also feel free to, I see that Margaret, your question stole my next bullet. So there's a question in the chat of how can one find out about salaries paid by awarded grants, whether that's federal, state, or private foundation. They do have to report grant income in 990s. That's typically on a specific line item. Those have to be reported again. So again, if your organization is awarded a grant and hires an external resource like a contractor to come in and deliver on part of that grant, that has to be included in the 990. Per federal law and governing, they have to include that in the 990 if they're filling those out accurately. So feel free to check that first. Your grant application may also include that as an estimate. So they may not have the entirety of the budget line by line, but they likely have included an estimate on that. So you may be able to find that as well. Sometimes it even works to reach out to the awarding institution. If you don't have a copy of it, or if someone's not willing to share a copy of that, one, red flag. But if they aren't willing to share a copy of that internally with you, you may be able to reach out to the awarding institution and ask, say, hey, I'm currently employed by this organization and I'm working on this grant. Whether you are or not is none of their business, but I'm working on this grant and would like to be able to reference the original proposal to ensure that we're staying in line with the proposed budget. And they likely will provide you a copy of your grant application if you reach out and kind of frame it correctly. So in addition to that, government transparency resources and their HR publications also are a great place to look for these for grant paid out salaries, et cetera, because in a lot of cases, if you are awarded government paid grants or grants that are funded by state or federal, they have to have publications and out into the general public on what they're paying for each of those things. So again, feel free to check those out. I think things like I don't know if anyone's applied to folks or talked to folks at things like the Smithsonian, but like all of their pay information is publicly available because they line up to federal pay bands that you can go research and look at exactly the federal pay bands and people who sit in those pay bands. The other items that are maybe kind of less federal facing, less like highly, legalized, regulated things that have to be out there are great crowdsourced locations. So if you have not been on Glassdoor, glassdoor.com is both a place to have dialogue and discourse about roles, et cetera, in your industry. So it's a great place to have that discourse if you're having trouble finding a community. But it's also a great place to look up companies. All of those are publicly posted by employees or ex-employees salaries based on particular role titles. So this is not going to be a holistic bank of pay for your organization. If your organization is very small, it may not be on Glassdoor. But if you're joining a mid-sized or large organization, they may have postings on Glassdoor where folks have self-reported their own salaries along with benefits packages. So this is a super great place to look, especially as you're in that negotiation stage and kind of looking at ranges. And I actually love to look at Glassdoor as I'm looking at companies before I even submit an application, because if they don't have a range out, I'm checking Glassdoor before I'm submitting. Because if I see that their range on Glassdoor from someone who's posted a salary 2 years ago is way less than what I'm interested or willing to take, I'm not even bothering applying. I'm not going to waste my time applying to something where I know the range is much smaller than they're willing to pay me or than I'm interested in being paid. Job banks as well. So ZipRecruiter, Indeed, other services like this, even LinkedIn's getting a little bit better about this, are getting better about requiring some version of a range on postings. So that's also something to keep in mind. And the last two here are, again, community sourced, but things like salary surveys. AAM's is behind a paywall. Maybe one day it will not be, but right now it is behind a paywall. Your organization may have access to this, so just keep that in mind. If your organization is a particular level of AAM member, and or if they have it from previous years, it may be worthwhile for you to ask and look for that resource if you're currently employed and looking to have discourse for yourself or your teammates around salary adjustments. But there also are some community sourced versions of this. NEMPN hosted a salary disclosure informational database, very easy to search. You can see kind of bubbles across the US and global for folks that have reported salaries in their organizations, along with very detailed benefits information. And Art Museum Transparency has a great, very robust database, about 3,000 submissions and counting, that they did back in 2019. So I recognize what has changed since 2019, but it's still a good reference and baseline point for you to be looking at as you're moving into future discussions. I see there's a couple of comments in the chat. A review on Glassdoor said, run, just run away. So that's the other piece there, right? Is sometimes you may go look at some of these things like Glassdoor reviews or even some of those community sourcings and say, oh, maybe the salary is really good, but maybe it's not the culture that I want to be working at. So again, these are good preemptive things to be looking at before you go to apply to an organization and spend your time applying and interviewing if you don't think it's going to be a good fit. Let me pause. Questions about finding salary data? Is there anything else that you guys have used as a resource that you really liked that is not on this list? Anything else you want to add, Kelsey?
Many times people ask if anybody has the AAM salary survey, and I've seen it shared on the NEMPN Facebook group and hopefully in the future on the Discord. So if you don't have access to it from yourself or from your organization, feel free to ask for it from somewhere else, or if you don't feel comfortable asking your organization, hopefully somebody at NEMPN can hook you up.
Love it. Shout out to the Discord. So keep it alive on there, you guys. We'd love to continue to see the reshares of it. With that, we've talked a little bit about some of these and said, okay, some of these are a little complex. Kelsey, do you want to talk to us a little bit about GuideStar and 990s?
Sure. If you don't know what a GuideStar is, you are not alone. I went to a nonprofit conference, wasn't museum specific, and so many people did not know what a 990 was, or what a GuideStar was, or any of this stuff, or because a lot of people come into nonprofits or museums because they want to do good or they have a passion for it, but don't necessarily know the ins and outs. If you would ask me to give this talk not 15 years ago, in 2015, when I was at the very beginning of my museum career, I wouldn't have been able to tell you what accounts readable was. If you asked me to read a 990, I would have read it and maybe figured out some stuff, but it's not the most straightforward, especially because a lot of programs are either academic masters like mine or museum studies masters that do a lot of like theory and stuff, but don't necessarily include this kind of data. So like Michelle said, a GuideStar is free. Your organization will probably have one. And you can sign up to maintain it if you're at the higher level of your organization. And they're going to post salary data. There's other levels of different transparencies. So this is often used by donors to see how transparent these organizations are. Just because somebody doesn't have the top tier, which is platinum, doesn't mean that somebody's messing around with your money, whether you're a donor or a job applicant. It just means how much time they kind of decide to spend on this site, but it gives you a really good look maybe at some demographics if they've chosen to put that, but you will be able to find 990s there. Sometimes you can also just Google them, but other sites require a sign up as well, and some of them are behind a paywall. You can access a lot of information from GuideStar or Candid just by having a free account. So you can go and take a look at the institution that you might be looking to apply for through here and see what their 990 looks like. So let's pull that slide up. So why would you want to look at a 990? It looks like a bunch of databases, not even cute ones with objects. You're going to want to look at this because it tells you about the financial health of your institution. And what I like to look at is scroll down and you can see how much the top earners make. Now, obviously, if you're an entry-level person, you're not going to be making comparable to what these folks make, although I personally believe that entry level should be there should be a cap for the relationship between entry level and the top tier earners so that they can only earn a certain percentage. But that's not the case in most institutions. So you'll see some really inflated looking salaries for presidents and things like that, but it also tells you, and this the Brooklyn Museum layoffs were mentioned earlier, how much are the top people making and how much are they offering you. So when you go in to negotiate your salary, and this is to address the scarcity mindset question that we had from Madison, because that's really real. You often feel like a kind of a personal responsibility not wanting to negotiate your salary or other benefits because you believe in the institution and you're kind of getting the sense, or they're telling you there's no money. Here's where you can find a look and see if there really is no money. And a lot of times you can use that information to say, hey, I don't think that I should be skipped out on a raise because I can see on the 990 that the institution had X amount of net revenue the previous year. So if you're telling me that there's no net revenue, but I see an excess of, depending on the size of your institution, let's say 100,000 or 300 or 500,000, there's going to be some information there. This also tells you whether your institution has an endowment. Sometimes they mention this on their website, sometimes not, but it will be on their 990. And it might also tell you a little bit, depending on how much they choose to make public on their 990, because there are parts that don't have to be made public, how much or what they actually do with their endowment, right? A lot of places will only take a percentage of the interest. Some places they had a capital campaign recently that they needed to backfill, and they're taking out a lot from their endowment. So this can also kind of tell you about, okay, how much room do I have to negotiate based on the financial health of the museum, but also how long can I expect to be employed by this institution based on the financial health of this museum. For example, if you Google the Brooklyn Museum, they have a bankruptcy or some sort of massive financial crisis every like 4 or so years, and then they get an influx of cash and then it happens again. So you really want to make sure, if you're especially relocating, and especially relocating to an expensive place, that you really try to take a good look at the 990 to get a sense of the financial health of your institution. And I see there's a question about what defines top earners. Yeah, the number of people listed is not consistent. Maybe Michelle knows a little bit more about how much you have to earn to be required to be listed. I think even for myself, my salary doesn't have to be listed because it doesn't break $100,000, but it's listed anyway because that's what we believe is the right thing to do. Do you have any info to back up about the legality of who's listed?
Yeah, it's a good question. So unfortunately, they only require you to list at least one person if you're paying employees. So if you have anyone submitting tax refunds effectively that you've issued a W-2 or a 1099 to, they have to be listed here. So if your organization has one full-time employee, guess what? Their salary is going on here regardless of what that number is. For organizations that have a lot of employees, I think we're looking at a snapshot from AAMs. Obviously you're looking at this and you're like, Michelle and Kelsey, they employ a lot more than 5 people. They do employ a lot more than 5 people, but you can see based on their base compensation number, they've clearly put in some kind of line in the sand, probably around $100,000 as the bare minimum to be listed here. Again, with Kelsey, whether or not that's the right thing to do is a different discussion, but this should at least give you a sense of, hey, if their VPs are making $130,000 a year and I'm asking for $85,000 a year and it's not some level of a senior manager or director style role, it's probably not going to happen, right? So this can also help reality check. So even if you don't see a lot of items listed here, it's a good way to just think about, hey, is there a world in which that's going to help inform my discussion?
Right. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to talk about some of the other things you can negotiate, but we are also available for questions after as well.
Yeah. So with that, maybe let's talk about the last couple of items here in terms of what else can we negotiate. And we've got some additional items at the very end for context on kind of thinking about other things as you're negotiating these items. Like we mentioned at the top, there's a category here of like kind of mid-level negotiation items. We call them mid-level because they likely they're going to vary institution to institution. So these are not consistently negotiable based on your institution. And there may be some flexibility based on who else they've hired, how your staff and team is organized. So again, these are things that you're open to start a discourse on with your HR person or whoever is interviewing you, but there are a lot of things that you may not be able to push on if your organization's like, yeah, we don't do bonuses. Like we don't do hiring bonuses or starting bonuses or whatever, then that's going to be a non-negotiable for them, even though somewhere else may be very open to that conversation. So let's like quickly talk about these just in a couple of buckets. One, money. Let's talk about stuff that puts extra cash in your pocket. And then we can talk about stuff that's on the benefit side. Not that that's not cash in your pocket, but it just feels a little bit different in terms of cash not going out of your pocket. So let's talk about extra money. Bonuses. You may be eligible for having a discussion around a signing bonus, relocation bonus, and or performance-based bonus. Signing bonuses are, signing and relocation bonuses are what I would strongly encourage if your organization is interested in giving them to you or is flexible on conversation. Typically these are one-time things immediately upon you signing and or starting. So typically like if they do relocation, they may give you a flat bucket and say you get this amount of money to foster a relocation and you get to keep anything that you don't spend, which would incentivize a cheaper move maybe for you. Their signing bonus may just be a flat number that's included in your first paycheck or after your first 30 days. The trick around a signing and relocation bonus that your organization is typically not going to inform you of until you look at all the paperwork is that they're normally eligible to be repaid if you leave the organization within a year of joining. So keep that in mind. If this is intended to be a stepping stone role, or you're a little unsure about the role and responsibilities, you may not want to opt for things like a signing or relocation bonus because they may insist that you pay that back if you leave within 12 months of starting. Again, this changes a little bit based on the particular role, but keep an eye on that. Performance-based bonuses are a great item to be talking about in your institution if they don't do them. Your organization may do these annually when they do an annual performance assessment, but this is a good one to bring up and say, hey, if you're not willing to do a bonus now, if you're not in the financial place to do it, talk to me a little bit about how you guys do annual assessments or your annual performance reviews. And if you guys are open to performance-based bonuses based on if I exceed your targets. So if you can get them to give you kind of very clear role guidelines, definitions, or requirements, you may be able to negotiate performance-based bonuses after a certain period of time or assessment of your work. The other thing that I put in here that you may be like, Michelle, that's not really extra money. It is PTO. If your organization does paid time off, think about if and when you may want additional PTO days. Again, this may be flexible depending on how big or small your organization is. Some say, nope, this is the number everybody gets. But this does put extra money in your pocket by being able to say, hey, I've got additional days for flexibility for myself that I can take and be paid to not have to take that day off for whatever personal reason, et cetera, I don't want to. So that's your extra money bucket. Let's talk about stuff that's like not necessarily extra money in, but is less money going out. So let's talk about flexibility benefits. Start date is a big one. And you may be like, Michelle, I need money today. Like I am not flexible on start date. I hear you. But this is a good thing to be thinking about if you've got costs for relocation, if you have, if you're waiting to finish up a degree program, if your current boss requires a little bit of notice, you can be a little bit flexible on these start dates, especially if you get a very strict PTO budget, if you have any upcoming vacation or travel planned that you don't want to have to burn your PTO on, see if they're a little bit flexible on your start date. That may give you a little bit of wiggle room to not have to burn PTO, to save that for later if you need it later in the year. Work location is the other item on here under benefits and for that flexibility. Your company, your institution may or may not be interested in having you be hybrid or remote. And that would be a great item for work location flexibility, both because it may allow them to say, hey, we're going to keep your salary at some level, right? But you may say, okay, but I can't live on that in New York. And they may be like, well, you can be hybrid. We'll only have you in 1 week a month. So you can live much farther out or less central to maybe where the museum location is, and then have a lower cost of living area where you're normally based and come in very irregularly to come in and do programming, et cetera. So feel free to open that discussion based on the kind of role you're in. Yes, Kelsey.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up our discussion because we are at time.
Yeah.
So we can continue some of these things in the coffee house tomorrow and in the morning, and also at the final NEMPN Power Hour. You can also find us on LinkedIn or at our NEMPN emails. And just to leave everybody with this, make sure that you take a look at your work status. Is it part-time? Is it contractor? Some organizations will try to put you as a contractor even though you're legally part-time. And what does that mean for your benefits eligibility? You can also try to negotiate maybe for them to pay a little bit more of your health insurance. If they offer 50%, maybe they can pay 50, 60, 75% rather than giving you a pay increase, because sometimes organizations don't like to do that because of levels of salary caps, but then you'll still end up with more take-home pay. So that was a real quick wrap up. And I know Michelle has a lot more words of wisdom to share. So hopefully she'll be able to join us at the coffee hour or the power hour, or you can find her or me on LinkedIn or again at our NEMPN emails. So thanks everybody so much for attending our session, and we wish you a merry MWOD.